fun. We're back with the deck.
All right, here we go.
Oh, be settled.
So however you want to start,
Oh, well,
without a notebook?
yeah, I guess I was thinking you were going to prompt me and ask me
Oh, if you'd
to.
like me to.
Yeah, generally you'll, like, give me some kind of a prompt.
Okay. Can you please give us the background on Alvin Northrupp's military career?
Okay, William Northrop joined the Army at the age of 15, and he enlisted as a drummer, which suggests, because he enlisted in that role, that he already had some musical aptitude. And the drummers served a vital role in the Army in signaling and in training of soldiers. So as the American Army, which was very much a nascent army at the time, a lot of soldiers with not much in the way of military experience were really getting their on-the-job training in Rhode Island. The drummers helped in the training by beating cadences so that the soldiers could learn to all do things in unison. You know, left face, 2 movements, signal of the drum. Shoulder, arms, 3 movements, signal of the drum, all in unison. And the drummer helped induce this timing for the soldiers. They wouldn't necessarily use this in battle or anything, but in the training it was vital to set a cadence to get the men thinking and doing things all together, which was critical for the military technology of the era. The other signals that the drummers did were in keeping the activities of the camp from day to day. Every morning, reveille. Well, that's a drum signal. We think of it today as bugles, but at this time it was beat on the drums, maybe accompanied with a fife, but the drum was essential. Half an hour after reveille, there's a formation, an assembly. Well, that's another drum signal. All throughout the day, there's a water call and a wood call and time for food, time for this and that. Everything that happened in the camp had some kind of a drum signal to go with it, all the way until tattoo at the end of the day.
Can you please speak to us on the background of the militia system?
Right. The militia system in Rhode Island goes back to the founding of the colony and the charter under which the colony was founded. So the British government gives a legal vehicle for British subjects to settle on this new continent. They establish colonies, the colony has a charter, and the charter includes a passage that says that the colony will provide for its own defense. And a colony provides for its own defense by having a militia. The charter also includes a clause that talks about being able to charge their own taxes within the colony. So it's setting up a remote government that can operate more or less independently of the government back in Great Britain. Now, the militia system providing for their own defense is to both defend the colony against any Native American incursions of trying to displace the colonists from land that they've claimed, and also to prevent colonies from having conflicts with each other. So whatever they need to defend against, they can provide for their own defense. By the middle of the 1770s, this militia system doesn't have a lot of meaning in a colony like Rhode Island that doesn't have any big threats on its borders. It's a coastal place. It's a thriving, burgeoning trading center now, an economic engine. But the militia doesn't need to be defending against anything. It still exists. Until the tensions between the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, when the British government, for very legitimate reasons, is looking for ways to raise revenue in the colonies.
I am sorry.
What happened?
I didn't turn the speaker on. I got that one.
I don't know if I turned the recorder on either. You told me to turn this on and I didn't, so.
Yeah, the button that says on. Yep, hold it down.
So should we start over?
That one we picked up.
Oh, that would have picked it up?
Yep,
I can start over anyway.
So,
You can do some editing, right?
yep.
Whatever's your preference.
okay, so, can you give us the background on the militia system?
When the Rhode Island colony was established, it was established under a charter granted by the British government, as were in general the colonies in North America. And one of the provisions in the charter was that each colony was to provide for its own defense. One of the provisions in the charter was that the colony would provide for its own defense. Well, the colony provides for its defense by establishing a militia system where they can call citizens to arms when necessary. By the 1750s and 60s and early 1770s in Rhode Island, the militia system wasn't particularly necessary because Rhode Island didn't have any threats on its borders. They were not having great conflicts with their neighboring colonies. They were not having uprisings of Native Americans or slaves. So the militia didn't really have a lot to do until the early 1770s, when the British government is now trying to find sources of revenue from the colonies. These colonies which had been established 100 years before and were now economic engines and had much greater populations than had ever been anticipated. And the British government was looking for very legitimate reasons to get additional sources of revenue from the colonies. This led to a lot of tax laws, which the colonists thought were against provisions of their charters, because the charters said that the colonies would charge their own taxes within the colony. So a repeated series of laws, tax laws, were created, protested, and then repealed, until finally in the early 1770s, an incident happened in Rhode Island that we know of as the Gaspee Affair. I won't go into a lot of detail about it, but it gets into the British government trying to enforce revenue laws that were already in place but that had not been enforced for a long time. This conflict happens with a British warship, a British naval vessel, the Gaspee, getting burned down to the waterline, and all of the people involved are now subject to being arrested and sent back to Great Britain for trial, but nobody comes forward to help them. A critical thing that came out of this was an establishment of things called the Committees of Correspondence, where the colonies agreed to reach out to each other and cooperate in their protests against laws by the British government that they thought were in conflict with their colonial charters. So now the colonies are going to help each other. Move forward a year to the end of 1773, when we have the Boston Tea Party, which was another protest against a new kind of tax law, which from the British perspective had good legalistic reasons to put in place, and from the colonial perspective had some good legalistic reasons to not be a legitimate law. The citizens of Massachusetts protest with the Boston Tea Party. The British government responds by shutting down the Massachusetts colonial government, and they declare martial law. The Massachusetts government responds by setting up its own government in Worcester, which was very much against British law now. But with the Committees of Correspondence, the other colonies in North America, 13 of the colonies, agree to support Massachusetts in this rebellion in 1774. Suddenly, the militia system in all of the colonies, including Rhode Island, becomes very important and becomes very active. Instead of meeting just a few times a year just to pay lip service to being a part of the militia, now the militias start meeting regularly and training, making sure that soldiers really do have the weapons that they're supposed to have, that they know how to use them, that they have the kind of equipment they might need if they get called to finally do something as soldiers for the first time. state companies of infantry like the Kentish Guards and the Gloucester Light Infantry and the Kingston Reds and the Newport Artillery get established and chartered in 1774. So the militia system is becoming very active in the state now.
Okay. Can we talk about the transition of William Northup from drummer boy to drum major?
Okay. William Northup had joined the Army in 1777, probably at the age of 15 as a drummer. This suggests that he had some musical aptitude already because he was able to enlist in this role as a drummer. But only a year and a half later, he becomes a drum major. Now, the drummers before are they're heavily involved in training to set cadences so soldiers can move in unison, and they're playing signals throughout the day for the soldiers when to wake up, when to go here, when to do this, when to do that, when to go to sleep again. The drum major is responsible for the management of all of the drummers in a regiment, so he might be in charge of anywhere from 10 to 20 drummers, and perhaps the fifers as well. And he's responsible for teaching them what their duties are. He's responsible for talking about which drummer is on duty every day, whose responsibility is it to wake up at whatever time in the morning and play the reveille and then play the long roll for the assembly and what have you. So the drum major has a great deal of responsibility, teaching the drummers how to do what they do and managing their day-to-day routines.
Can we talk about his transition from the Army into the Navy? Okay, so can you speak to William Northup's transition from Army into Navy?
Yes. William Northup spent almost 3 years as a soldier, as a drummer, and then a drum major in this army of observation that was keeping an eye on the British troops that were posted in the islands in Narragansett Bay. But by the middle of 1779, the different terms of service he had enlisted for and served for expired. He certainly had the option of enlisting again, but instead he took a different path. He decided to do what quite a lot of soldiers did in this phase of the war, to go where the money was, and the money was in privateering. A privateer is a privately owned vessel, hence the name, that operates under license to a government to act as a naval vessel. So it's a private vessel that now has permission, a document called a letter of marque, M-A-R-Q-U-E, from the government that says you can go out on the high seas and you can try to capture enemy ships. And capturing ships can be extremely lucrative. If a privateer captures a ship with a precious cargo, the ship gets sent back to a port, the cargo is auctioned off, the ship is sold, and the money gets divided up among the crew. Now, of course, the captain gets the lion's share, and the officers get the share, but everybody gets their cut. Well, William Northup spent a few years in the Army and probably heard about other people getting rich as privateers. Now, it's extremely risky because you can also be captured at sea and put into a prison for being a privateer. But if you're a successful privateer, you can make a lot of money. Now, I'm not aware of details of Northup's service as a privateer. Some of this comes through to us only anecdotally. But apparently he was on a cruise and a ship was captured. When a ship gets captured, it has to get sent to a port. So a small portion of the privateer crew goes on board the captured ship to sail it back to port. And one of those crewmen is put in charge as the prize master. So they've captured a ship, that's the prize. Somebody has to be in charge of the small crew to send it home. That's the prize master. And it appears that William Northup was the prize master of one of these captured ships. He's the master of the vessel, so by naval tradition, he's called the captain. even if he doesn't have the actual rank of captain, the commanding officer of a ship is the captain, or the master, more properly in the time. But it's okay to call him captain. And this is probably where this moniker of Captain William Northrop comes from, assuming it's applied to the right William Northrop here. The story is that as a prize master, he was bringing the ship home. He was maybe up in the masts, and there was a storm. There was enough danger that he got his calling. You know, if you get me through this, I will turn my service to you, Lord. And he got through it. He came home in 1782, and he founded the Baptist Church in North Kingstown.
So did he come back a young man relatively well off for being a prize master?
He may have been well off from being a prize master. One thing we don't know is specifically what privateer he was on, what ships that privateer captured, what the value of their cargoes was, and how that money was distributed once it got back into port. He may have ended up quite well off from this. He certainly didn't end up being a poorer man, but we really don't know how much it benefited him personally, because there could be a lot of legalistic issues. It's easy to just say once the ship comes into port, it gets auctioned off, but there's a lot of process that has to happen. Sometimes it could take years for the money to be distributed. And the information may exist on this, but I'm not aware of anybody who's done the trolling through the necessary documents to try to find exactly how much he may have benefited from being a privateersman.
What happened to the original crew of the ship that was captured?
Okay. When a privateer took a prize, the crew of the prize ship became captives, and then there were different decisions that could be made. They could just agree to continue to serve as crew on their ship under the prize master peaceably. They could be held on the privateer. They could agree to serve as crewmen on the privateer, or they could get sent back to a port and imprisoned. It really depends a lot on who that crew was and what they as individuals chose to do. Now, if a privateer captured a naval ship, which was quite rare, but it could happen, if they captured a naval vessel, then the naval crew become prisoners of war straight away. But a lot of the vessels that the privateer is capturing are merchant vessels at sea, and they might be under a British flag or maybe not. But so what happens to the crew of them really depends on the individuals on the crew and what their choices are, both the crew of the privateer and the crew of the prize ship. A lot of these vessels are crewed by volunteers who sign on. We think today of sailors very much in a naval context, but if we turn and think about the merchant marine, these are all individuals with maritime experience who might sign on to an individual ship for an individual voyage. And when the ship gets into port, their contract is up, and then they can sign on to another individual ship for an individual voyage. This is how the privateers are operating. A man can go out for one cruise, and if they're successful and he thinks, wow, now I can earn a lot more money, he might do it again, or he might choose not to.
So as a drum soldier, he did not make a lot of money.
A drummer in the Army earned more than a private soldier. The Continental Army and the Rhode Island State Troops, there was a question of how much they earned on paper and how much money they actually received. And often the money, the value of the money is another challenging topic, because each state is trying to develop its own economy, print its own currency now. There's a war going on. The value of the money fluctuates a great deal. But what it comes down to is soldiers didn't make a lot of money. Today, soldiers don't make a lot of money. It's not a lucrative profession. So certainly after spending 2 years in the Army, there's a great deal of allure to signing on to a privateer and hoping that fortunes would be with you and you'll make a lot of money.
So that ended with the war?
At the end of the war, peace is signed, there's no more privateering anymore, there's no more soldiering anymore. The Continental Army actually disbanded at the end of the American Revolution. And for a period of several years, there was no United States Army at all. The US government thought they could go back to relying on the militia system. Rapidly, that proved that that was not an effective thing for a nation to do, even if that was their disposition, was to think they wanted to do that. It wasn't practical, and having a standing army became a necessity.
Which is pretty much the last thing they wanted.
Exactly, last thing they wanted. There was a lot of mistrust about standing armies in that era, which was part of the whole issue, you know, with British troops being sent here in the first place, this mistrust of governments with standing armies. But as we see, there's no way around it, really.
Can you speak to us on the rebellion becoming a revolution?
To really understand what brought about the American Revolution, we have to go all the way back to 1763 and the end of the French and Indian War. Now, Great Britain won the French and Indian War. Like, woohoo, we won. But then in North America, they had an interesting problem to manage. Now, they had 3 groups of people in North America who had been in conflict with each other for a long time, and now they were all British subjects. In Canada, there was a large population of French-speaking Catholic people. In New England, there was a large population of very Anglican, English-speaking people, and there'd been a lot of conflicts across the borders over the previous century. And then there was a large Native American population that had been on these lands for time immemorial. So we had French-speaking Canadians who were British subjects, we had Native Americans who were British subjects, and we had land-hungry European settlers all along the eastern seaboard who were all British subjects. And the British government had to manage them all now. How do we keep the peace among these people? Well, one of the laws that was put into effect was that the colonists on the East Coast were not allowed to cross the Appalachian Mountains and settle on the other side. That was Indian Territory as it shows up on the British maps. That was the place that the Native Americans could have. From the Appalachians to the Mississippi River was all for the Native Americans. Well, the settlers on the East Coast, not all right on the coast, but the settlers in the East hated that idea because a lot of them had come to America for the very purpose of trying to settle that land. And there were a lot of land speculators already surveying these lands, every intention of moving onto that land that was now declared Indian Territory. And the Quebec Act said that the people living in Canada who spoke French and had been following French laws and customs for decades could just keep doing that. At a high level, they were under British authority, but on a local level, they could keep their laws and customs. And again, a lot of the settlers in New England didn't like that idea at all. So there was a conflict, and to try to help mitigate this conflict, the British government said, well, we're going to have to set forts along this settlement line that we've established, and we're going to have to garrison those forts with soldiers, and that's going to be expensive. And we have a big war debt from the French and Indian War. How are we going to pay for this? all we want to do is keep the peace among all these new British subjects. We have to have soldiers in North America to help keep the peace. It's going to be expensive. We need to generate revenue from these colonies. So the British government, again, the British Parliament, passes laws both to start enforcing some revenue laws that had already existed and some new revenue laws to start charging taxes that hadn't existed before. Well, all of these things the colonists saw as being violations of colonial charters. Colonial charters said that each colonial government charges its own taxes within the colony, and that each colony provides for its own defense. So the idea of the British Parliament charging taxes and the British government sending troops to North America both seemed to be in violation of the colonial charters. Both sides had good legalistic reasons for their perspectives, but they were in conflict with each other. We move forward. The British government, again, Parliament passes a tax law. Americans protest. The law gets repealed. They try a different tax law. Americans protest. The law gets repealed. This happens repeatedly. Let's move on to 1772. The British government tries to enforce maritime commerce laws that had not been enforced for a long time. Laws that existed but hadn't been enforced. They send ships called revenue cutters, we might think of them as Coast Guard vessels, to inspect cargoes of ships to see if they're legal or not. This seems to Americans who have been practicing trade very freely for decades, to them it seems like overreach. Rhode Islanders come up with a very clever scheme to try to get the orders from a British revenue cutter called the Gaspee. They run the ship aground. There's a whole story about how they effect this. But the Gaspee gets grounded. Rhode Islanders board the Gaspee. All they really want is to get the captain's orders to see that he's really behaving within the scope of the law, but the ship ends up burning to the waterline. Now, whether this was intentional or not is a subject of debate, but one way or another, a British Navy ship gets destroyed. That's a big deal. The British put out arrest warrants for everybody involved, and nobody is caught and held responsible for the destruction of a British Navy ship. Well, as part of this, one thing that develops out of this is the establishment of what are called committees of correspondence. Colonies agreed to start working together in their protests of the British laws. So they cooperate on keeping hush-hush about the Gaspee. The following year, the British tried another type of tax law. They actually offered tea to the American colonies at a cheaper price than it was possible to get tea in the colonies at any time before this. There is a tax on this tea, but it's cheap. From the British government perspective, this looks like a win-win. You can get all the tea you want, it doesn't cost you very much, and you are paying a little tax on it. Colonists see right through this and say, well, if we let this tea get landed here and sold and we pay a tax on it, that sets precedent for other taxes that we don't think are legal because our charters say we charge our own taxes. Both sides have a very good legalistic perspective, but the result in 1773 is the Boston Tea Party, which for the British government is the last straw. The British Parliament makes a plea to the king and says we need to punish the colonists in Massachusetts for destruction of this tea, which was government property, and the British shut down the government of Massachusetts. Said, forget it, revoking that colonial charter we gave you, we're putting you under martial law until there's restitution made for this. This is 1774. The Massachusetts colonists say, too bad, we're just going to set up our own government. Well, that's very much in defiance of British law. They set up their own government in Massachusetts. This is the beginning of the American Rebellion, the Revolution. Starts in 1774. It leads to the Revolutionary War. So we don't have a revolution that started because of a war. We have a war that started because of a rebellion, because of a revolution that started in 1774. The Massachusetts colonists know darn well that what they're doing is going to be considered illegal by the British government. They can't just set up their own colonial government without the blessing of the parent government back in Great Britain, but they do it anyway. And they use the committees of correspondence to get support from the other North American colonies. So 13 colonies altogether come to agreement to support Massachusetts in their rebellion, and they start activating their militia systems. They start training. They know this is probably going to come to blows, so they start training their militaries.
Do you want to speak to the British presence in Rhode Island?
War broke out in North America at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, as we all know. By March 1776, the British had to evacuate Boston. And from the Americans' perspective, things looked pretty good by March and April 1775. There were no British troops in any of the 13 rebelling colonies anymore, at least no significant presence anywhere. Looked like the war was won, but the British government wasn't done, and the Americans pretty well knew that wasn't going to be the end of it. The British government made a massive commitment now to fight a real war to end this rebellion. This is when the king gets involved for the first time. The quarrel the Americans had in 1775 had been with Parliament that was passing the revenue laws. There was no talk in 1775, at least not widespread, of declaring independence. But after Lexington and Concord, after the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British king got behind Parliament and said, I'm calling out the army. The only way we're going to end this thing is by using a massive military force. Now the king becomes the enemy too, as far as the rebelling colonists are concerned. By the middle of 1776, this massive army arrives, lands in New York, Staten Island. There's a lightning campaign that rapidly drives American forces out of the New York City area, and it becomes the British headquarters, the seat of the British military in North America for the remainder of the war. Highly successful British military campaigns. The American army is doing very poorly in 1776. Toward the end of the year, winter is coming, and the British know that they need a good harbor, good deep water seaport for their navy. And that seaport is in Newport, Rhode Island, another rebelling colony. They send a large force from New York to land on Aquidneck Island. We often just call the whole island Newport. At the time of the American Revolution, the biggest island in the bay was called Rhode Island. So I may refer to just the island as Rhode Island sometimes here. The British send a large naval force and a large army force to Rhode Island, and they land unopposed. The Americans know they just don't have enough troops, enough of anything to try to defend the island. So now Newport and the adjacent island, Connecticut, where the town of Jamestown is, are occupied by the British for the next 3 years. It's December of 1776 when the British troops land. Nobody knows for sure what's going to happen next. Are they going to advance and take Providence? Are they going to try to go overland and take Boston again? It's not clear. The Rhode Island militia system and Rhode Island state troops now have been active for almost 2 years, so they have all the mechanics of putting up some kind of military defense in place, but they're still new at it. Still a lot of localized organizations, military organizations working together. But they rally, they respond, and set up what I'll call an army of observation all around the mainland, from on the east side, from Little Compton, all the way around up through Tiverton, Bristol and Warren, and then over to East Greenwich and down through North Kingstown and what is now South Kingstown and Narragansett Shore. They post troops. They start building fortifications, earthworks with cannons in them if they have the cannons available. Places where they can keep an eye on the British troops on the island, because they have no idea what might happen next. Are the British going to launch some kind of an additional invasion? Are they going to try to take the entire colony of Rhode Island? Are they going to go on to Massachusetts? What will they do? We don't know. All we know is they've got a really big army and a really big navy there. They're all professional troops. They're really, really good at what they do. And we need to keep an eye on them. We need to be alert. So anytime we see any movement going on, we see soldiers getting onto ships, we see ships moving anywhere, we need to send signals all around the colony so we're ready for whatever might happen next. This is where William Northup spends 2 years in these different posts on all different parts of the mainland around the island, keeping watch. As a drummer, he's ready to beat the long roll in assembly anytime there's an alert, anytime British troops might be seen getting into boats to come across the bay for any reason, anytime British naval ships in the bay move from one station to another. He's beating signals. He's helping to communicate to the troops what to do and where they need to be.
Did you want to speak to anything in that book about the daily duties of a drummer?
Okay. As a drummer, William Northup played signals every day. There was a lot of well-established military science at this time period. You could go in the 1770s to any bookstore in Boston or New York or Providence and buy any number of military textbooks that talked about how to manage a battalion of infantry, how to build fortifications, how to operate artillery. One of these books was by a prolific British military author named Thomas Symes. He published a book in 1768 called The Military Medley, Rules and Directions for Managing for the Complete Knowledge of the Army. Explanation of military terms, anything you need to know if you're a military officer to manage a bunch of troops. It's got diagrams and printed forms for filling out daily reports in it. It talks about how to enlist men. It talks about how to conduct military funerals. Well, it also includes signals for the drum. And somebody like William Northup, certainly he may have owned a book like this, or an officer owned such a book, may have copied down all these drum signals into an orderly book and said, here you go, drummer, this is what you need to do. Here's the signal for the troops to do a left face. Here's the signal to do a right face. Here's the signal to march. Here's the signal to wheel to the left or right. Here's the signal to halt. Everything that's needed to do to manage and maneuver troops, at least to train them. Maybe not to do this every day, but at least while they're in training and learning how to do these things all together in perfect unison. This is where the drummer's duties were vital for the training of the Army.
Can you speak to us on summarizing regimental structure?
All right. There's a book coming out soon called Defenders of Rhode Island by John K. Robertson. It's going to go into a lot of detail about all of the individual military organizations that were in Rhode Island during the Revolutionary War, on the militias, the state troops, the Continental Army troops, the British, the German, the French troops. Everybody who served in Rhode Island is in this book. So I'm just going to give a more general summary of typical structures of military organizations. The main military organization, what I'll call the central one, was a regiment. And a regiment, if it was at full strength, the easy way to think of it is thinking of it as about 500 soldiers, 500 officers and men. The actual size varied depending on which army it was in and what year and other things, but a good rule of thumb is to think of it as about 500 officers and soldiers. It's usually divided into about 10 companies. So if the regiment has 500 men, then a company has about 50 men. And a company, some regiments are divided into only 5 companies of 100, so there's variation. A company has 3 or 4 officers. It's usually commanded by a captain and has 1 or 2 lieutenants and an ensign. These are commissioned officers. And then it has 2 or 3 or 4 sergeants, 2 or 3 or 4 corporals, 1 or 2 drummers, maybe a fifer, and 40 or 50 private soldiers. Those are the only ranks you get at this time period. There are different grades of sergeant and different grades of private soldier and all that. A sergeant, a corporal, a drummer, and a private soldier. Officers, captains, lieutenants, and ensigns. An ensign is like an officer in training, really. The regiment is commanded by a colonel or a lieutenant colonel and has a major. So there's 2 or 3 what they call field officers in the regiment, and then 10 of these company officers, the company captains under them. There's some nuances in there. This is a way to keep it nice and simple. So on a day-to-day basis, one of these company officers is going to be the officer of the day for the regiment. So they rotate this. Who's the officer of the day? And then depending on where the regiment is posted, imagine, for example, a regiment, 500 men, they're in North Kingstown. So they might have a portion of the regiment up in Quidnesset. It's right on the coast, sticking way out into the bay, a little fortification there. Maybe 1 or 2 companies of the regiment is there, and 2 or 3 companies are in Updike's Newtown in Wickford, and maybe another company way down as far south as you can get near Plum Point, is it? Or down there, near where the Jamestown Bridge is. So the regiment might be spread around. So a company captain is going to be in charge of each of those posts, but on a day-to-day basis, you might put 1 of the lieutenants in charge, or even 1 of the ensigns in charge. And each day at each post, there's a duty drummer. William Northrop has probably spent a lot of his time as the duty drummer. He's the guy who, when an officer, somebody looking out over the bay says, "Oh my gosh, there's a British warship is on the move, it's coming this way." He tells the officer tells the duty drummer, "Beat the long roll." And they'll call the troops to assembly, and the drummer beats the long roll when the troops assemble. This is the kind of thing on a day-to-day basis that's going to be going on here. That officer might then send a dispatch rider to the commanding officer of the regiment back in Wickford and tell them what's going on. They can call the whole regiment to assemble at one place. For example, now there's boats coming. It looks like they're going to be landing in Quidnesset. We better get all the troops there. So the troops that are way down at Plum Point start to march north. They start to assemble.
Do you mind giving us a little piece on your resume, your books?
Okay. My name is Don Hagest. I studied the American Revolution. I'm the editor of the Journal of the American Revolution, which is an online history magazine. Also a published volume every year. It's a publication that's owned by Westholme Publishing, which has a substantial catalog of Revolutionary War books. I've also written a number of books about the American Revolution, all focused on people during the war. My main focus is on the British soldiers who served in America as individual people. So I have a book called Noble Volunteers, the British soldiers who fought the American Revolution, which will tell you about who these soldiers were, when soldiers may have joined the army, what their careers were like, how were soldiers recruited into the British Army, how were they trained, how long could they be expected to serve, what kind of motivations, what was their day-to-day routine like. There were about 2,000 British soldiers who served in Rhode Island during the American Revolution. If you've ever wondered who they were as individual people and what their lives were like, this book will talk about that. I have another book called British Soldiers, American War, that is a compilation of writings of British soldiers who served in America during the Revolution. Unfortunately, we don't have any detailed writings by British soldiers who served in Rhode Island, but this book has most of the known narratives of British soldiers who served in other parts of the war. And I have one of my favorite books, is about American soldiers. It's called The Revolution's Last Men, The Soldiers Behind the Photographs. And it talks about 6 American soldiers who lived until the time of the American Civil War. And they had their photographs taken. And a book published about them in 1864 that, interesting though the book is, and remarkable in that it contained their photographs, it has very mangled and corrupted biographical sketches of the soldiers that are not particularly accurate, the book from 1864. So I'd researched these men and what their real careers were like, and how the memory and information about those careers evolved in the following 80 years since they served in the Revolution to end up being this book in 1864. And that's some of the kind of work that I've done. I've had the good fortune to work on the PBS American Revolution documentary directed by Ken Burns, an upcoming Netflix show called Turning Point about the American Revolution that will be released next year, as well as quite a lot of other interesting writing projects.
Thank you.
That just makes it sound like I have credibility.
I think that was the easier way to do it than having to write it all out.
Yeah.
Have it right there.
I can send you written things if you want.
No, thank you so much.
Yeah, and I don't know if you might want to, if you want a moment close up of the books or anything like that, anything you want. We can always get together again if you want more or want different. What do you think, Oki? Did you have fun here?
Is there any documents online of his pay, Northup's pay or anything?
Not that I have looked for. I would love to research that, but I just don't have time. I've got other.
No, I
I've
understand.
got a lot of. But the first place to look would be the Revolutionary War pension records and Revolutionary Service records, which are in the U.S. National Archives, but they're available on fold3.com. That's a subscription service, but it's got a lot of that. If you don't find it there, I will send a note to John Robertson, who wrote these books I'm talking about, and see what he'd suggest, because he has gone into archives all over the state ferreting out materials. And there's a huge amount of unassimilated information about the Revolutionary War still sitting out there waiting for people to pull it together. And like for a soldier who served in Rhode Island state regiments, I don't know the best way to research them because I haven't done that kind of research myself. And I've been focusing on the British records and the British soldiers.